Do you delight in fright? Have you survived countless nights with Michael, Freddie, and Jason? Then welcome to AMC's Fearfest, a month-long celebration of your favorite horror classics. All October, AMC has non-stop scares with marathons of the most can't-miss horror classics. We're talking Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Final Destination. Plus all the icons of fright you've come to expect from Fearfest, including Carrie, Jeepers Creepers, and It. This year, Fearfest is truly a carnival of frights, and it is hosted by the incomparable Janelle Monáe. Even the most unhinged slasher has nothing on our Hallow Queen. AMC's Fearfest, these aren't just scary movies. These are the scares you love to come back to every October. Embrace the joy of horror with Fearfest, all October on AMC. Welcome back to another old edition of Nightmare Fuel Creeps and Peepers. The revisiting of some of my favorite early Nightmare Fuel stories continues as we count down towards Halloween, which is now only 2 days away. And again, on Halloween, you will get a new story called The Dead House. Tomorrow, you get one more of my favorite early stories that maybe some of you new listeners haven't heard yet. Today, we are revisiting The Disruptor, originally released on September 6, 2024. My first real attempt at cosmic horror. What out there in the black void of space could arrive at any moment and turn some of our world upside down? I hope to write a lot more cosmic horror in the future. I love both horror and sci-fi, and it is so fun to blend the two. Thanks to AMC's Fearfest for sponsoring this Nightmare Fuel re-release. I highly recommend noise cancellation headphones for the ultimate listening experience. Time now for the tale of The Disruptor. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. H.P. Lovecraft. The universe and its design is often one of arbitrary horror. Laird Barron. Claudia rocked back and forth on her favorite chair on the rickety and rotting front porch of the old 2-story home she and Dennis had raised 3 kids in, before her beloved husband passed away over a decade ago now. Even though he was handy, Dennis never really cared about fixing up the place. Never really cared about working enough to be able to hire someone else to fix it up either, if we're being honest. But Claudia never really minded. No one ever made her laugh quite like Dennis, and she knew she'd never love anyone else like she loved him. He'd smiled more than any other man she'd ever met, and when he smiled, that big, dopey, genuinely giddy, what are you so damn happy about smile, childlike in the best possible sense. She couldn't help but smile herself. Claudia smiled now as she thought about Dennis's grin, as she stared at a perfectly clear night sky, gazing beyond the ridge that stood on the other side of Lightning Creek, directly across the road that divided her 5 acres from the hundreds of acres where the Henderson family had been grazing cattle for generations. They'd worked that land since long before she and Dennis had bought one of the area's original homesteads, where the Laughlin clan once lived and died, and were buried in the small cemetery about 30 yards to Claudia's right. Her boys had been convinced growing up that the little cemetery was haunted. If it was, the ghosts were sure quiet, because she'd been living near them coming up on 50 years now, and hadn't seen or heard from them once. She started to laugh a little as she remembered the time Dennis hid in that cemetery, the evening they both finally gave the boys permission to go ghost hunting at midnight. Dennis made sure to tell them to be very careful, to never, no matter what they did, never, ever stand in front of the old metal cemetery gate, stare at the headstone of Lincoln Laughlin, the patriarch of the family, and say out loud 3 times, "By the light of the stars at midnight, we command you, Lincoln Laughlin, with all our might, to rise from your grave before our very sight." Claudia and Dennis both knew, of course, that after hearing that spiel, the boys would for sure try it, which was exactly why Dennis told them that in the first place. And they did. And when they finished saying it for the 3rd time, right on cue, Dennis leapt out towards them from behind the tombstone, wearing some sort of zombie Halloween costume and screaming the loudest, most monstrous roar he could. My God, did the boys squeal and take off like something right out of Looney Tunes. Micah, the youngest, got trampled by both his older brothers as they hightailed it back towards the house, and Claudia got to watch the whole show from right where she now sat on the porch. It took her a bit to properly console her boys and tell them they didn't see a ghost, they saw their dad, because she was laughing so hard she couldn't breathe. It was, and remains, the funniest thing she'd ever witnessed in her entire life. Damn, she missed Dennis tremendously. And she missed her boys something fierce, of course, as well. But by God, they sure did a great job of building a big old pile of wonderful memories she continued to cherish and visit often in her mind. Her boys didn't come around anymore like they used to, which of course left her with watery eyes and a heavy heart in moments. In a lot of moments, actually. But she also understood. Her youngest lived overseas and had 3 boys of his own to raise. Her oldest, Chance, only lived a state away, but he might as well have lived on the other side of the planet. He was just never great about keeping in touch. And her middle child, Arthur, called a lot, but he was a 6-hour drive away. And it was hard for him to leave work, and harder still to find a place to put his family up for the night in the dying town of Dillon. The town that saw its primary employer, the Morton Tamarack Lumber Mill, burned to the ground over 2 decades ago. These days, the area's 3 motels were mostly full of long-term tenants. No self-respecting parent would ever feel comfortable letting their kids be around. Any rooms that were vacant were likely full of bedbugs, and maybe also some bloodstains. The town was a whole lot rougher than it used to be. Claudia would love to have her babies and grandbabies stay with her, but as much as it broke her heart, she just couldn't fit a family of 5 comfortably into her own home. Her house was barely standing by the time her youngest left high school, and it was in much worse shape now. Areas of the floor that used to be lined with rotten boards desperately in need of replacing were now virtual windows, looking into the floor above or below, or down into the dirt beneath the home where a proper foundation was never built. The walls had holes in them as well, and the parts that didn't have holes were filled with mice. It had been over a decade since Claudia herself had even spent a night in the place. Dennis had bought and fixed up a used RV a few years before he passed, and that's where she'd slept ever since. Slept, cooked, used the bathroom, watched her game shows, did her needlework. It was where she did almost everything. But she still loved to sit out on the old porch of the old house when the weather allowed. So many memories sprawled out in front of her as she looked out over the big yard that was mostly weeds now. The yard where she and Dennis had watched their boys grow up, running wild and free, playing football or wrestling or sliding down towards the fence on a watered-down run of old plastic tarp they'd found one day at the dump, what they called their country slip and slide. And the porch was where she and Dennis and the boys, and then she and just Dennis, and then just herself, got lost staring up into the vast celestial night sky. It was every bit as astonishing and free from light pollution as it was the day she and Dennis first sat on the porch together, just before their oldest was born. Stargazing had long been one of her favorite things to do, to behold the infinite, and remember that in the grand scheme of things, some rotten floorboards and some mice didn't really matter. Rich or poor, envied or pitied, in the end, we were all so very small, our time here so very short. We were all built from the same stardust. Claudia had sat and stared in quiet wonder at the stars hundreds of times over the years, maybe even thousands. And while tonight was far from the first time she'd ever seen a shooting star, it was the very first time she'd ever watched one land right in front of her. Claudia was looking over to her left after thinking she detected some movement atop the large bluff that stood there, wondering if it was that black bear she'd suspected had been getting into her trash recently, coming over to look for a snack, when she saw a bright pulse of white light in her periphery. She whipped her head around to the right to stare directly in front of her, barely in time to both see and hear the meteorite land, no more than 40 yards away. It sunk into the dirt, just on her side of the massive swath of blackberry bramble that grew between the road and the edge of her yard. Bramble that had long ago completely overtaken the old barbed wire fence the Laughlins had built that now fought to stand wearily beneath it. "I'll be damned," she muttered, and then nearly turned further to her right and added, "Did you see that?" As if Dennis was still sitting on the porch with her, instead of resting in the family's cemetery plot. She was glad her children weren't around to criticize what she decided to do next. They wouldn't have ever wanted her to walk down and inspect it. They didn't even want her living on the property anymore and wished she'd agreed to move into an assisted living facility. She'd had trouble the past few years with her memory starting to slip. Enough trouble that Arthur had asked her, on behalf of his two brothers, what she thought about the possibility of moving into a place where some staff could keep an eye on her. She had zero interest, she told him, emphatically enough that he hadn't brought it up again. But she knew as well as he that dementia was lurking ahead around the corner, and probably not far off. She'd witnessed her father and both of her paternal grandparents steadily lose their faculties in their final years, and she'd recently accepted that the same fate awaited her. Fortunately, her mind was sharp this night, and her body was surprisingly agile for a septuagenarian who'd literally never stepped foot in a gym. Claudia, shaking a bit with excitement, stood up, stepped off the porch, and started to walk down the gentle slope of what sort of resembled a lawn without bothering to turn on her cell phone's flashlight. She'd wandered from her porch to the road and back again so many times over the years, she could have done it with her eyes closed. And besides, the nearly full moon and bright stars lit up the sky well enough for her to easily make the trek. When she got close, she swore she could feel a bit of the warmth from the small, smooth space rock that burned and melted as it passed through the Earth's atmosphere. The impact had left a crater in her yard bigger than she'd expected, close to 10 feet in diameter, she guessed, and nearly 3 feet deep. At its bottom sat a smooth, dark, rust-colored stone, roughly the size of a volleyball, weighing somewhere between 15 and 20 pounds. A big one, Claudia said out loud, her eyes widening. A real big one. She let out a small squeal of joy and almost started to cry. This was like hitting the lottery. A 1 in a million, no, 1 in hundreds of millions, or 1 in a billion opportunity. She couldn't believe her good fortune. To not only witness such an incredible spectacle, but to have it happen on her property. Her mind began to race with scenes of various news crews rushing out to her house to break the story first. She'd be interviewed by reporters from all around the globe, maybe even from her favorite news source, the BBC. Perhaps David Willis. She didn't think he went out into the field much for stories anymore, but with a story like this, who knows? She'd be the first person from town, maybe even from the entire county, to ever be interviewed by him. Her boys would show the video to her grandkids, and they'd probably think that she was famous. She wondered as she got down on her hands and knees, and now did turn on her phone's flashlight to get a better look, how much money she might get for the space rock. She knew museums bought them, and probably private collectors too. She'd once read a story about a museum in Maine that paid $25 grand for one that was only a pound or two. This one would fetch a small fortune. It didn't look like any other meteorite Claudia had ever seen or heard of. She might make enough to rebuild her house, enough to have plenty of room for all of her kids and grandkids. Claudia was overjoyed, thinking all sorts of happy thoughts like these, when she felt a small, sharp pinch between the thumb and index finger of her right hand. It felt a lot like a spider bite, and that's exactly what she thought it probably was, even though she couldn't find the little rascal that did it. It throbbed painfully for 10 or so seconds after the initial pinch sensation, and then a tiny red, slightly raised bump sprang up. Then, almost as quickly as it came on, the throbbing stopped, and within half a minute or so of it happening, she wasn't worried that it was anything serious. Living out in the country, bug and spider bites were just a part of life. She took a few pictures of the meteorite and then worried that it might burn her to touch it or that it had emitted some kind of radiation or something. She decided to walk back up to the house, grab some work gloves and a wheelbarrow to haul it over to her Subaru. But by the time she'd made it halfway back, she started to feel feverish. And then a few moments after that, she felt dizzy. She wondered, did she get bit by something serious? A black widow? She was still wondering what kind of spider must have bit her when her vision began to dim. Her head started to feel light, and she knelt down about 30 feet from the porch to keep from falling over. Then she sat down before slumping over to the side and losing consciousness. Claudia Nelson's 74-year-old body convulsed and twitched for several moments and then went still. And it remained still for the next several seconds as her breathing and heart rate slowed down, and almost stopped completely. A few more seconds later, her eyes popped open suddenly. Her heart began to pound as she took in a huge gulp of air and bolted back up to a seated position. Claudia Nelson now purposefully scanned the land around her, as if looking at it all for the very first time. Allan Fitch listened to Steve Winwood's roll with it on cassette for about the 1000th time as he barreled down Lightning Creek Road with a full load of firewood in the back of his old Datsun. Luckily, he didn't have to drive the little pickup truck much anymore, mostly just to head up into the hills to grab some wood for the fireplace or to haul something out to the dump. It was 36 years old and had over 150,000 miles on it. It actually still ran like a top, but the amenities were pretty scarce, and what few the truck had typically didn't work too well, like the radio that had fritzed out years ago. Thank God Winwood held up. His tape had been stuck in the player for over a decade, and tonight it was either Steve or silence. It had taken Allan quite a bit longer than he figured it would to grab some firewood up on Baker's Saddle, and he was getting back a lot later than he'd planned. Oh well, it's not like since Chloe left, he had anyone to rush home to anymore. She'd even taken Boomer, their basset hound. Allan's life was decidedly not going as planned. Not anymore. He'd made it out of Dillon when he was 18, just like he dreamt of doing all 4 years of high school. Chloe Sargent, his high school sweetheart, made that easy for him. She'd broken up with him near the end of his senior year when he turned down an offer to attend the University of Idaho in Moscow with her, choosing instead to go to school over 1,300 miles away at Creighton University in Omaha. Chloe had no interest in moving anywhere that was more than a few hours from home, while he'd wanted to get as far away as possible. And once gone, he'd wanted to stay out. And for years, it looked like that was exactly what was going to happen. He'd left Omaha for Destin, Florida after graduation when he got in a sales job at a golf course there, and then he left Florida a few years later for Myrtle Beach when the opportunity came to work at another, bigger, better golf course. He'd liked South Carolina. A lot, actually. He'd met Sophie there and they dated for most of 8 years. He loved her, but there was something that kept him from pulling the trigger on getting married and having kids, and she finally got tired of waiting. Maybe in the end, Myrtle Beach had started to feel a lot like Dillon, just another place to get stuck. Or maybe he still wasn't over Chloe. Probably both. Not long after he and Sophie were through, he'd come back home to Dillon for his 20-year high school reunion. And now it felt like that was the dumbest decision he'd ever made. A part of him knew what was going to happen, and like a damn fool, he came home anyway. He'd known from Facebook that Chloe had moved back home after her divorce, was single, and was raising her 2 daughters in Dillon. And he'd seen, after looking through a lot of her recent photos, as in all of them, multiple times, that she looked better than ever. She looked amazing. Small-town life suited her. She was glowing. The second he laid eyes on her back in the high school gym where they'd gone to homecoming and prom and numerous other dances together, the same gym where they'd once snuck into the boys' locker room and nearly lost their virginity together before Mr. Stowers barged in unexpectedly and almost caught them, he was sunk. In that moment, he convinced himself that maybe he should have never spread his wings, that he should have never left Dillon for Omaha and Florida and South Carolina. He should have stayed with Chloe. Her girls should have been their girls. They hooked back up that night, and a few months later, he was moving back to the same damn town he couldn't wait to put in his rearview mirror forever. He and Chloe were married before he'd been back a year, and then things were the best they'd ever been, for a few years at least. But now he was back to driving the same shitty pickup he'd driven in high school, the one his dad had bought from him for $500 when he'd left for Omaha, the one his dad had given back to him for free when he returned home a little over 20 years later. And now he was still home. But he wasn't with Chloe anymore. They were still married, but only technically. She was currently waiting for him to sign the divorce papers that had been sitting on his dining room table for the past week. And everyone in town knew exactly why they were getting divorced. Piper Swift. God damn it. 2 years younger than he was. It seemed like he and Piper were about to start dating right before he and Chloe got together back in high school. And he'd wondered, here and there over the years, what it would have been like to be with her. And then she moved back to town about a year ago. Of course she did. With rare exception, everyone moved back to Dillon eventually. It was a running joke. You can take the boy or girl out of Dillon, but you couldn't keep them out of Dillon. And damn it if Piper didn't look better than ever as well. And she still held an old flame for him. He was the one that got away, until he wasn't. Until one really stupid night when he ran into her after grabbing a few too many beers at the Long Branch with Stu when Chloe was home sleeping. He was walking home when she called out to him from her front lawn. "Hey, stranger, in a big hurry to get home? Or do you have time for one more beer?" He almost told her no. Almost waved her off. but he didn't. In a rare moment of impulsivity, on a hot summer night when no more than 3 beers had already turned to 6 or maybe even 7, when Piper was wearing one of her signature thin cotton dresses that barely kept all of her tanned, toned curves from spilling out, he told her, "Sure, like an idiot." And he'd walked up to that porch without anyone holding a gun to his head, without even being consciously aware of how unhappy he was because not even Chloe could quite make Dillon worth it for him. He'd walked up to that porch knowing damn well where that one more beer was really going to lead. And now, here he was, back in Dillon. Stuck in town thanks to a tough job market and a resume years removed from his old sales career. Driving his old Datsun with no Chloe and no Piper either. He knew there wasn't much of a chance he'd be able to win Chloe back, but he also knew that chance would be absolutely zero if he ever slept with Piper again. And he did want Chloe back. Probably. It was complicated. Life damn near always felt complicated for Allan anymore, and most days he wished he could just want less, be happy, or at least appear happy with less, like most of his old classmates seemed to do. Life wasn't all bad in his hometown, though, he tried to remind himself. He did have one of the few good jobs managing Dillon's only bank, and damn if the night sky wasn't as beautiful as ever. The clearest, most stuffed to the gills with star sky he'd ever seen in his life. And tonight, it was particularly gorgeous and active. He hadn't heard anything about a meteor shower, but he'd already seen several shooting stars since the sky went dark not long after he'd started driving home. And now, he was approaching the Nelson place. So many memories. Good memories. God, he'd spent so much time there growing up. So many sleepovers in Dennis and Claudia's death trap of a house with his old buddies Chance and Arthur. His mom had been half convinced that he was going to die in that home in a fire. "That dump is practically made of kindling," she'd say. "If it ever catches fire, it'll be up in smoke in an instant." And she wasn't wrong. But that fire never started. Allan made a mental note as he began to drive by to stop in soon and check on Claudia. See how she— Oh, shit! Allan yelled as he slammed on the brakes and barely avoided bouncing Claudia Nelson off his bumper or crushing her beneath his tires. She was standing in the middle of the gravel road, facing him, calmly staring in his direction. She didn't even attempt to get out of his way. "Holy hell, Claudia! Are you all right?" Allan shouted as he popped out of the truck. Claudia stood stiff and still less than 6 feet away. "Fine. Nice night out," Claudia said in a way that was completely tonally off. Something weird was going on. "I need a ride into town, Allan," she added. All right," Allan replied, confused before saying in a failed attempt to joke about nearly running her over, "You know the hitchhikers usually stand on the side of the road, right?" Claudia didn't acknowledge what he said. She proceeded to walk straight to his passenger door, open it, and get in. "Okay," Allan mumbled to himself as he returned to his seat, wondering how it was possible for her to not seem the least bit shook up after nearly being turned into roadkill. How could she not even mention almost being run over? And what the hell was she doing out in the road? Wasn't her Subaru running just fine? Hadn't he waved to her as she drove by in it just the other day? "Did your car break down?" Allan asked her as he started to drive. "I haven't been to your house before, have I?" Claudia answered his question with one of her own. No, I guess you haven't. Sorry about that," Allan answered, utterly perplexed. And then he flashed on what Arthur had told him the last time he'd come to town. Dementia. Of course. She was clearly having some kind of episode. "Take me to your house, now," Claudia demanded. Yeah, you bet. Already headed there for the night." "Already headed there for the night," Claudia mimicked. Allan didn't like the way she was looking at him while she repeated what he'd said. He didn't have dementia in his family and couldn't actually recall spending any real time with anyone who suffered from it, but didn't they generally have a sort of vacant look about them? Lights are on, but nobody's home sort of thing? That was not what he saw in Claudia's eyes, not at all. Claudia had always been plenty smart, but what he saw now was a new and different kind of intelligence. He couldn't quite put his finger on what was new or different about it, but whatever it was, he really didn't care for it. Already headed there. How have you been lately? How are the grandkids?" Claudia didn't respond. She just kept looking at him, like she was sizing him up. If she had been some random guy, some out-of-town hitchhiker instead of the mom of a couple of his best childhood friends, he would have worried about her taking a swing on him. She then surprised him again when she reached over and grabbed his right arm, just above the elbow, and squeezed. He flexed his bicep instinctively, and she smiled. "You have a better vessel," she said now in that same flat, odd tone. He'd never heard her speak this way before. Did dementia make you take on an entirely different personality sometimes? "Vessel?" he repeated, trying to lighten up the increasingly awkward and uncomfortable mood, saying, "I don't think I've ever had anyone compliment me on my vessel before. Thanks, Claudia." "I don't think I've had anyone compliment me on my vessel before. Thanks, Claudia," Claudia eerily repeated. Allan was getting increasingly creeped out about everything Claudia was doing. She kept mimicking him, she was still holding onto his arm, and she was still staring at him. And then what she said next made him even more uncomfortable. "You're much stronger than this one. I could do more with you." Allan was at a loss for what to say. He desperately wanted Claudia to let go of his arm, but he also didn't want to risk upsetting her and have her go berserk. And then she said the creepiest thing of all. "I need to end so I can experience you." Allan had just barely begun to absorb how truly disturbing of a thing that was for Claudia to say when she let go of his arm abruptly and started to frantically look around the cab of his truck. She quickly saw something beneath her and bent forward and grabbed a large flathead screwdriver he didn't realize was lying there. She held it up menacingly in her right hand. "Stay there," she commanded before she swung it. Allan threw his right arm up to shield his face and heard the sickening plunge of the screwdriver into flesh as he did so, immediately followed by the thump of Claudia's hand hitting not his body, but her own. When he dropped his arm and looked back towards her, she was staring at him again and smiling. "The bones are hard," she said happily, and maybe also curiously as she pulled the screwdriver back out of her chest cavity, with blood seeping profusely from the new wound. "Claudia, don't!" Allan shouted as he slowed down and pulled the truck over onto the shoulder. "Won't take long now," she smiled as she slammed the shaft of the screwdriver back into her chest. This time it only sunk in a few inches. "Not strong enough," she almost apologized, and she ripped the shaft back out again. Allan had brought the truck to a complete stop now and was taking off his seatbelt as fast as humanly possible. "Stop, Claudia, please stop!" he yelled as he popped out of his door to run around and open hers and get a better angle for disarming her. But that wasn't the only reason he got out of the truck. He did not want to be in the cab with her anymore. He didn't think Claudia was the only one in danger. "Bones are too thick for this arm," she said now to herself more than him it seemed, as she stretched the arm she'd spoke of out as far in front of her as she could, and then slammed the screwdriver back against her chest harder than ever. Allan had made it around to her side of the truck now and opened the door. She turned to face him as she pulled the bloody tool back out of her chest yet again. "Almost done," she said, coughing up blood after speaking. Before she could slam the weapon into herself this time, Allan grabbed the wrist of the arm that held it. "Claudia, no! Drop it!" he pleaded. Instead of responding, she grabbed his arm with her free hand and then opened her mouth and pulled her head forward as if to bite him. Allan tried to jerk his arm away from her and in doing so, accidentally pulled her out of the truck and she spilled down onto the side of the road. "Claudia, drop the screwdriver and calm down, please!" he yelled. She paused and looked right at him from the ground. "Stay here," she barked before slamming the screwdriver into the soft flesh right below her sternum. She buried the tool up to the handle. Allan, instead of wrestling away from her, he now tried to step back, and she used her free hand to grab his calf. "Stay here," she barked again. "No, stop!" he yelled, and was able to shake his leg free and back away further. Whatever Claudia was now stared at him fiercely, and it ripped the tool loose and then slammed the screwdriver over and over again into the soft flesh of her neck, severing her carotid artery on the second or third attempt. Blood spurted everywhere. As she bled out, Claudia smiled and continued staring at Allan until the light left her eyes. Allan, in shock, took out his phone and was about to call the cops when he thought about how it would all look to Chief of Police Cam Baumgartner, the guy who used to be his high school football coach. "Yeah, Cam, I was just driving to her house when I saw her standing in the middle of the road and almost hit her. She told me to take her to my house, and after saying a bunch of crazy shit, she told me she needed a better vessel and started stabbing herself with my screwdriver. So I pulled over to stop her and, well, that didn't work out, did it?" That kind of conversation only ends one way, in handcuffs. And also, every fiber of Allan's being told him he needed to flee, and quickly, before whatever had been talking to him tried to take his vessel. He didn't even fully understand what that meant, but he felt it was true. Allan stumbled around back to his side of the truck, jumped in, reached across and shut the passenger door, and started driving. He left his friend's mom's dead body by the side of Lightning Creek Road, right where it meets the highway, heading into Dillon. Cam! Dillon's chief of police, Cam Baumgartner, was woken from a dead sleep at a little after 4:30 in the morning by his wife, Tammy. What? He groggily yelled back. It's Tissy. Someone just called in saying they found a dead body at the bottom of Lightning Creek Road. They think it's Claudia Nelson. Shit, Claudia? Really? All right, 1 second. Cam swung his big, meaty thighs off the side of the bed, stood up wearing nothing but his boxers, and walked over and grabbed the landline. He always turned his cell phone off at night when he was home, and there was just too many people too quick to call him at all hours of the day that had his number. After getting a few more details from Tissy Estevez, the county's primary graveyard shift dispatcher, Cam tried not to let his face betray how upset he felt to his wife. He got dressed, grabbed a bagel from the bread box, warmed up a little bit of yesterday's coffee in the microwave, and walked out of the house towards his Bronco at 4:45 in the morning. A screwdriver, he thought as he started to drive, feeling a mixture of fury, sadness, and disgust. People didn't get murdered in Dillon. He'd been in some form of law enforcement in the area for coming up on 30 years now, and no one had ever been murdered during that time. Not one person. Only one person had ever been murdered in the entire history of the town as far as he knew, when Ruth McLean took a shotgun to her mean old wife-beating bastard of a husband, Tom, when Cam was still in grade school. And by all accounts, it sounded like if anything, old Tom deserved that fate sooner than he got it. Why on earth would anyone take a screwdriver to an old widow like Claudia Nelson? Was the question Cam kept asking himself over and over as he drove down the lonely highway that doubled as the town's main street, without another moving car in sight. No, sir, not moving at all, Scotty Burnett told Cam as the two men stood next to Claudia's bloody and definitely dead body. Yeah, I figured not, Cam said. Judging by how cold and stiff her body was, he figured she'd been dead for several hours, if not longer. And you never touched that screwdriver? He asked, looking at the tool's handle sticking out of Claudia's shredded neck. No, sir. I never touched that screwdriver, Cam repeated strangely. There was something off about the way Scotty was acting and talking, Cam thought. Cam had known him since he was a little kid. Scotty Burnett had been a decent running back in high school, and a pretty good linebacker too, but not good enough to play in college, and without some sort of scholarship, he was never going to go. A damn shame. Too many kids from Dillon were in that same boat each and every year. With no direction after just barely graduating, Scotty made the mistake of hanging around town, and hanging around the high school in particular, most of the next 6 or 7 years, maybe even longer. And with each passing year, he became more of a joke. The kids cared less and less about how many touchdowns he scored that one time against Winchester or Avondale, or how many tackles he had when they made it to state his senior year. And pretty soon, as it does too often to too many around Dillon, the light started to dull in his eyes, the wrinkles in his face came a little faster than they should have, and the meth took a hold of him. Cam had personally arrested Scotty for using 3 or 4 times, and he'd been arrested a few other times as well by other officers for doing dumb shit like drinking and driving and crashing into the Arco gas station, or breaking into Lonnie Zinnerman's shop and stealing a bunch of his tools and then trying to sell them to another guy who knew and worked with Lonnie. So stupid. Cam figured the last call he'd ever get about Scotty would be the one where he found out about how he'd OD'd and died. But to his credit, Scotty had turned his life around about 10 years back and gotten clean. And then he got a job at the town's waste treatment plant. Not glorious work, but great benefits and a steady paycheck. And lately, he was doing a bang-up job of helping raise the little boy he'd had with Lynn Bowman. But right now, he seemed off. And Cam couldn't help but wonder if he was using again. And you didn't see anyone else around when you pulled up? No cars or nothing? Cam asked. No, sir. No one else but me. No cars or nothing, Scotty repeated with an odd knowing smile and an overly curious look in his eye. Scotty, Cam sighed. Using again? Scotty repeated. Using what again? Come on, Scotty. Now's not the time for games. You know what? Meth. You seem off. Scotty looked over at Claudia's body before he answered. Cam wished he could wipe that strange smile off of his face. "No, sir. I am not off. I have not used meth in some time," he stated too matter-of-factly. Then he turned and looked at the gun on Cam's hip. "I have some of those at home," he said before seeming to cut off what he was about to say next. And then he added, "I need to leave now. I have so much to do." Cam instinctively placed his hand close to his Glock without even consciously choosing to do so. Something about Scotty was making him real uncomfortable. "All right, Scotty. Keep your phone handy and don't leave town, okay? I'm sure I'll have more questions for you soon." "Yes, sir. I'm sure you'll have more questions for me soon. I will not leave town. I like it here," Scotty said, still wearing that strange, knowing little grin, like he was so happy to have some kind of special secret. And then he hopped into his Silverado and turned around and drove back up Lightning Creek towards his house, which surprised Cam. Scotty had come across Claudia on his way into work, headed towards town. Why turn around and go home now? He was already late. Cam shook his head. Fucking meth. This was already one of the worst, most unusual mornings he'd ever had, and it wasn't even 6 o'clock. He finished taping off the crime scene and waited for a pair of detectives from Monroe, the county seat, to show up and help investigate and gather evidence. He wondered if Scotty's prints were going to turn up on that screwdriver. It wouldn't make any sense, since he'd called in the damn murder, but with meth, you just never knew. Nothing had to make any sense. Also, if not Scotty's prints, whose? Allan Fitch paced nervously around his empty living room. He'd been pacing, sipping on a coffee for over an hour. He couldn't stop thinking about Claudia. Why would she do that? He'd Googled all kinds of dementia-related questions on his computer and couldn't find a single example of anyone doing anything similarly violent and deranged. Not like that. Stabbing themselves? Over and over? And the look on her face, like she was just giddy. Like she couldn't wait to get it over with and move on to the next thing. The next vessel was the uncomfortable thought that floated up whether he wanted it to or not. What did she mean by that? Just dementia gibberish? Or something more? He also couldn't stop thinking about the screwdriver, about how it probably had his fingerprints all over it, about how he should have either stayed at the scene and called 911, or he should have taken the screwdriver with him when he left. By now, the cops would probably be checking it for prints. His prints would be found, and he would be royally fucked with a capital F. He could hear it all in his head. Allan Fitch. Hasn't been himself lately. Been going through a divorce. Went to visit his childhood buddy's mom. Probably wanted to borrow some money from her, which was laughable considering how poor she was. He tricks her into going on a drive with him. A fight breaks out when she realizes he is up to no good, and he stabs her to death and then dumps her body on the side of the road and flees. Flees with her blood all over his cab, no less. Fuck! He'd convict himself if he was on the jury. What was his motive? Didn't even matter. With all that evidence, the prosecution could make up whatever sounded halfway good and just call it a day. Damn! And he thought his life wasn't going well before all this. Allan at least had cleaned up the cab as best as he could right when he'd gotten home when his neighbors were still asleep, and he'd ordered a new seat cover on Amazon that was supposed to show up in 2 days. In the meantime, he just hoped no one would come over and peek in and look at the mess. And right now, he had to be to the bank to open it up in an hour and a half. And on Friday mornings, he almost always had breakfast at Oscar's at 6:30. He had zero interest in grabbing breakfast at the moment, but he didn't need anyone talking about him deviating from his routine. Nope, he needed to keep doing everything just as he'd been doing it and pray for some sort of miracle regarding that screwdriver. If his fingerprints really were on it, he was done for. But if they somehow weren't, he just might get out of all this with nothing more than nightmares. Once again, he pictured Claudia's face and shuddered. I need to end so I can experience you. Ugh. Allan set his day-old coffee down on the kitchen counter and walked towards the bathroom to take another shower before heading to Oscar's. Scotty, you forget something? Lynn asked her boyfriend as he walked back into their bedroom, waking her back up around an hour after he headed out to work. Scotty didn't answer. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Lynn could see that he was opening the gun safe. Scotty, baby, what are you doing? Lynn asked with alarm rising in her voice. I need to test this, Scotty said, without turning to look at her, speaking in an oddly flat tone she did not recognize. Scotty picked up his Springfield 9mm, turned and pointed it towards Lynn, and pulled the trigger. Click! Nothing happened. empty, he muttered to himself. Scotty, what the fuck are you doing? That's not funny, Lynn yelled as she scrambled up and popped off the bed. Scotty now chambered the weapon, and as Lynn tried to run, confused and terrified upon hearing the sound of a round entering the chamber, he fired just once, and a single bullet hit Lynn just behind the left temple and exited a little in front of her right temple, splattering blood, skull, brains, and hair against the bedroom wall. She was dead before her body ever hit the ground. Yes, this is good, Scotty said, satisfied, admiring the weapon's killing capability. The extraterrestrial parasite controlling Scotty like a puppeteer controls a puppet rapidly scanned his memory banks for more information on the weapon and turned to grab 3 new 20-round magazines Scott had recently purchased for himself, loaded and stored on the top shelf of the gun safe. This will be fun, the Scotty thing said to himself, with that queer, knowing smile returning to his face, as he and Lynn's 6-year-old boy Rocco ran down the hall towards him. Daddy, what happened? The frightened child's question was cut short by 3 bullets fired in rapid succession that all buried themselves in his small, shallow chest and exited out his back. He was dead within seconds. And as he died, the body of his father stepped over him, and the Scotty thing started walking towards the front door. The usual? Shamra asked after pouring Allan his coffee. Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Shamra, he replied as he smiled and waved back to Dale Sargent, who sat with some of his buddies in a booth on the other side of the cafe. Dale was Chloe's dad, and they'd gotten along famously before he'd fucked everything up. Dale hadn't spoken much to him since Chloe had found out about Piper. Getting away from him was new, but it was still awkward as hell seeing him. Small towns sucked when it came to breakups and divorces. It was just about impossible not to keep running into your ex, their friends, or their family on a daily basis. And they and everyone else in town all knew exactly why you were broken up. Shortly after getting his all-American breakfast of a few strips of bacon, scrambled eggs, some hash browns, and some toast, Chief of Police Baumgartner walked in looking right at him, and Allan's stomach dropped. This is it, he thought. My last bite as a free man, and now my soon-to-be former father-in-law is going to watch me get handcuffed and charged with murder. Mind if I join you? Cam asked, wearily. Not at all, Coach, Allan replied, confused. Is he going to eat some breakfast with me and then arrest me, he wondered. How's your morning going, Coach? Allan asked, tentatively. Not well, to be honest. I've certainly had better days, he said before lowering his voice, leaning a bit over the table and asking, Can you keep a secret, Allan? Just for a day or less? Allan lowered his own voice as well. Yeah, sure, Coach. What's going on? Claudia Nelson, Cam said quietly. Do your best not to react, which is going to be hard with what I'm about to tell you, but she's dead. Oh my God, Allan said, doing his best to feign surprise. What happened? He asked while his stomach seemed to be turning itself upside down and his knees felt weak. Murdered, if you can believe it. Some son of a bitch took a screwdriver to her, and I just can't wrap my head around why. Sorry, I know you two were close. Holy shit, Allan quietly gasped. Any idea who did it? Maybe, Cam said, staring directly into Allan's eyes. Allan half expected a few other officers to now walk in and for Cam to stand up and say something along the lines of, I think you did it, you son of a bitch! Your damn fingerprints are all over the screwdriver, dummy! Allan Fitch, you are being charged with the murder of Claudia Nelson. You have the right to remain silent. But instead, he said, Tell me what you know about Scotty Burnett. The two men proceeded to talk over breakfast for the next 20 or so minutes, as Allan relaxed further and further, realizing that if his fingerprints were on that screwdriver, Cam didn't know that yet. He didn't have much to say about Scotty, other than he'd seen him out at the bar a few times, but he never seemed messed up. No meth. He seemed good. Real good. Like maybe he was truly done partying and trying to still be that cool guy from high school. And then Cam's phone rang. It was immediately clear that whatever someone was telling him was real bad news. He now stopped talking quietly and made zero effort not to alarm everyone around him. Oh my God. What? You're fucking kidding me. All right. God damn it, I'll be right there. Call Lynn and tell her to stay put. We'll head to her place and check on her as soon as we have him in custody. Shit! Cam ended the call and didn't say a thing to Allan as he got up and started running towards the door. I'll square up with you later, Shamra, he shouted as he left the cafe in a panic. Shamra looked over at Allan, who shrugged his shoulders before dropping $40 on the table and getting up himself. I got us both, he said, adding, keep the change before heading out. He still had half an hour before he needed to be at the bank, which was only 2 minutes down the street. Right now, he had to know what the hell was going on. Cam raced his Bronco towards the town's waste treatment plant. Dispatch told him that one of the buildings there was on fire. When some locals living nearby ran over to try and put it out, Scotty Burnett had started shooting at him. Vernon Reed was already dead, and Lee Smith was heading that direction. Scotty had also fired at and missed Johnny Clay, who then called 911. The 2 county detectives were on their way from Claudia's murder scene, as was one of his cops, Mark Richards. Cam now drove across town faster than he'd ever done before, lights flashing and siren wailing, cursing and hitting his steering wheel, pissed off that he wouldn't make it to retirement after all, without having to shoot someone or be shot at himself. The Scotty thing. After shooting the first 2 men who tried to extinguish the fire he'd set to attract people, like moths to a flame, he thought, smiling at the saying that was old to Scotty but new to it, started to walk out the open front gate to the sewer plant. The shit show, he thought, which was Scotty's nickname for the place. It had already ended 2 men and almost a third. It wanted to end everybody it could, all of them. Wherever it was, whoever it was, whatever it was, it always wanted to end all of them. Everything that wasn't one of it. That was what its kind did best. And after feeding on a few more of these things, it would be able to split, to make another. And after feeding on a few more still, it and its new other would be able to create and replicate themselves. They could make so many more, and then the real fun would begin. Then they could burn it all down to nothing. "Scotty!" a man yelled from the backyard of the house above him. "What the hell are you doing?" "Having fun," the Scotty thing replied before firing 4 times on Rick Wheeler, a man he'd once saved from falling into a campfire at a party up in the woods many years earlier. Rick took 2 bullets to the chest and a third to the upper thigh as he fell back and out of Scotty's sight. He'd be dead in around 15 minutes. The Scotty thing kept walking as he heard a woman start to scream from the direction of where Rick had fallen. 2 junior high kids who'd been on their way to school now appeared from around the corner on the road in front of him. The kid closest to him barely had time to yell, "Oh shit!" before a bullet caught him in the face, entering his cheekbone just to the side of his right nostril and exiting out the back of his head, and taking quite a bit of his brains with it. His final move was to twist his handlebars in an attempt to whip himself around. Now instead, his already dead body flew over those handlebars and he limply face-planted onto the pavement. The second kid skidded to a stop and was already falling over onto his side when a bullet hit him directly in the right ass cheek and exited above his hip, followed by another bullet hitting him in the upper back and exiting out his left lung, followed by a third hitting him in his spine at the base of his neck. He suffocated, paralyzed, as he also bled out onto the ground. The Scotty thing just kept walking, kept smiling his wicked little smile as more screams erupted around him. He could hear sirens approaching and his mind flashed on Scotty's memories of watching movies and TV show scenes of shootouts with cops. He knew his time with this vessel was probably limited, but he would likely then get an even better, stronger vessel, one with more firepower. Cam saw 2 dead kids on bicycles before he saw Scotty and wondered how many other people had been shot. He thought about how the nearest legit EMTs were a solid 45-minute drive away in Monroe, as was the closest hospital. And it was a small hospital with a very young and very inexperienced ER staff. Their local EMTs, a ragtag crew of volunteers, still probably hadn't even made it to the old ambulance that was donated to them, a beater that now practically spent more time in the town's main auto repair shop than out of it. Dillon was just about the worst place in the country to have a mass shooting. There just wasn't the infrastructure in place to treat the wounded. Cam also wondered as he pulled over and parked his Bronco before driving directly into gunfire, and as he looked in his rearview mirror and saw the 2 detectives from Monroe coming down the street just a few seconds behind him, why the hell Scotty Burnett would ever start shooting anyone, let alone some children? Scotty had been a lot of things over the course of his hard life, but he'd never been violent. He'd never even been in one of the dozens, if not hundreds, of bar fights Cam had been called to bust up or walked into over the years that Dillon had sadly gained quite the reputation for. As Cam popped out of the Bronco and unholstered his Glock, Scotty came walking around the corner. No, walking wasn't quite the right word for it. Strutting was more like it. The son of a bitch had a nice little spring to his step, and a big smile plastered across his face, as if he was the grand marshal of the parade, or had just won the Super Bowl and was headed to Disneyland. instead of being the guy who's about to go to prison or die by a cop after committing multiple murders. "Scotty Burnett, drop the gun and put your hands in the air," Cam yelled. Scotty stopped, turned and looked at him, and his big grin got bigger. "How many guns do you have in your vehicle, Coach?" Scotty oddly and giddily asked him. What in the Sam hell was going on with him, Cam wondered, before yelling back, "Enough to put you down for good, son. Don't make me do that. Drop the gun and put your hands in the air." "I like you, Coach." This strange version of Scotty yelled back before stopping and then raising his gun and putting the end of the barrel to his own temple. Cam should have probably shot him when he started to raise the gun, but he really didn't want to kill some guy he used to coach, regardless of what he'd just done. And then before even really having time to consciously think about it all, Scotty made sure he would never have to do that. "See you soon," the Scotty thing yelled before pulling the trigger and blowing his brains out. Allan pulled up close to the shit show and stepped out of his car and surveyed a scene he did not expect, but also a scene that didn't shock him as much as it would have if it would have happened before what he'd seen with Claudia the previous evening. Chief of Police Cam Baumgartner was walking over towards some man's dead body. 2 county detectives were briskly walking about 60 feet behind him. A few adults he recognized were standing around what seemed to be a dead child who'd been riding a bicycle. He was 99% sure it was Sean Merrick, a good kid. Another group of adults were standing down the road around what was maybe another dead kid and a bike. And to his left, as he parked his car and got out, was yet another group, tending to a very bloody Rick Wheeler. Some of Claudia's final words echoed in his head. "You have a better vessel." And he knew that her death was somehow connected to these deaths. He had no idea how or why, but he was sure of it. He thought about how scared he'd been to be near Claudia as she was dying, how badly he'd wanted to get away from her body, her vessel. And he wondered, did whatever thing that had infected her also infect who did all of this? He watched Cam bend down and check the body beneath him for a pulse, and Allan was immediately afraid for him. He was about to yell out when he realized that if he explained why he was worried, he'd likely be arrested for murder. So he paused, and he saw Coach react as if something had just bit his hand, a hand he was now wringing out. Allan froze, waiting to see what happened next, and hoping like hell the crazy scenario that was playing out in his mind was going to be wrong. Cam knew Scotty was dead before he made it to his body. Hell, he was missing probably half or more of his brains. But he still had to confirm it. While he'd never had to shoot anyone, Scotty was far from the first dead body he'd had to take a good look at. He wasn't even the bloodiest. Luke Bruce, who blew his brains out with a 12-gauge shotgun in his dad's trailer several years earlier, took that honor. Holy hell, what a mess he'd left. But this was far and away the worst crime scene he'd ever stepped into. Crimes like these weren't supposed to happen in Dillon. He felt nervous. As he stooped down to put 2 of his fingers on Scotty's neck, Scotty had just been acting so damn weird. He half expected his eyes to open wider than they already were, or for him to take in a huge breath of air and grab him or something. But of course he didn't. He was very dead. Ah, damn! Cam felt a pinching sensation on the back of his hand, right below the bottom knuckle of his index finger. It felt like a spider bite. Cam wrung his hand out as it throbbed painfully for 10 or so seconds, and then he saw a tiny red, slightly raised bump where he'd been bit or stung. He thought about how strange it was that he hadn't seen a spider or any other bug, and how whatever had hurt him bit or stung him at the base of the fingers he was touching Scotty's fresh corpse with. And that made him think about Scotty's final words. "See you soon," as one of the county detectives, a young guy named Evan Jacobs, asked him if he was all right. "Yeah, fine," Cam replied absentmindedly. "Something bit me." "Sure, why not?" the other detective replied before adding, "What a fucking day." "Yeah, what a fucking day is right," Cam repeated. He was going to say something to the other detective, but even though he knew the man's name, he couldn't think of it now. His brain felt foggy, and he felt hot, like a fever was coming on quick. Cam started to say, "I think whatever just bit me might be something serious. I don't feel so good," when he abruptly fell forward, slowed his fall a bit by throwing both of his hands out, and then had his arms give out completely, and he continued to fall. He was unconscious by the time his face hit the road. Allan watched Cam fall to the ground and his stomach dropped with him. His stomach sunk even further when he watched Cam's body twitch and convulse, and then stop moving entirely. This was connected to Claudia, he thought. Whatever it was definitely connected. And it was real bad. As he listened to the sound of Officer Richard's siren approaching and the sounds of numerous other vehicles pulling up, within an hour he predicted the whole town would be milling around, Cam suddenly opened his eyes. And the two detectives helped the chief of police to his feet. And then before they saw what was coming next, Allan did. Cam's face, his smile, his eyes. It all made for the same look Claudia had. He wanted to warn them, to yell, "Get back!" or to scream, "Get away from him!" But why would they listen? How would they even understand what he was trying to tell them? There was no time. So instead, Allan started backing up towards his car. And as he did, he watched his old football coach, the current chief of police, unholster his Glock. And before the two detectives could process what was happening, he shot the first man in the chest, and the next man caught 3 bullets to his neck and face. Both dropped dead. As others around screamed and scrambled, a smiling, wild-eyed, morbidly joyous Cam fired at them. The town's beloved chief of police was now the new mass shooter. The scene was beyond surreal. Cam killed or wounded several people before running out of rounds, and then he dropped his weapon and bent down and picked up Scotty's. He popped out the magazine, inserted a new one Scotty had stashed in his front pocket. Then he grabbed a second one from that same pocket and a third from the other front pocket, and started walking towards his Bronco, firing shots at bystanders in all directions. One man, maybe Derek Shepard, fired back and hit him in the arm that wasn't holding the gun, and then Cam spun around quickly and fired 4 or 5 shots, taking out Derek or whoever the hell it was. "I want the shotgun," the Cam thing now gleefully exclaimed, as if they were all having a good time, just playing a fun little game of paintball, instead of everyone trying to wrap their heads around why the chief of police had become the town's second mass murderer of the morning. "Cam, drop your weapon!" Officer Richards now yelled. "No, I don't want to," Cam yelled back happily while simultaneously opening fire. Officer Richard wasn't ready. He wasn't ready for the entire fiasco. And by the time he tried to return fire, he'd already been shot in the leg and twisted around, so he missed. Meanwhile, the Cam thing kept on firing and soon hit him again in the arm and then twice in the stomach. Richards now dropped his gun and groaned and writhed around on the ground. Not dead, but definitely dying. Allan hopped into the driver's seat of his car, fired up the engine, and started to back away as Chief of Police Baumgartner made it to his Bronco and grabbed his pump-action Mossberg shotgun. Allan slammed on his brakes and threw the car into drive and was about to speed away to where he didn't know, when Cam walked towards the nearest group of people who had just pulled up in their Jeep and began firing. And then he saw Chloe. Shit. Chloe, like everyone else, as soon as the Dillon rumor mill let them know something crazy was going on at the north end of town by the waste treatment plant, had come to check out what was happening. And now Cam had spotted her. He started to walk towards her car, firing on other people in between him and her. Allan, realizing that he was the only person who had the slightest inkling of what the hell was really going on, understanding on some level that this would never end if everyone kept killing the current vessel before becoming the new vessel, and then killing and dying and repeating the carnage over and over and over again. He threw his car into reverse once more and backed up until he had the angle he wanted. He stopped and then slammed the car into drive and nearly spun his tires as he floored it, aiming for Cam. The chief of police was so focused on firing on the people in front of him, he didn't notice what Allan was up to until it was too late. Bam! Allan hit the chief of police at about 35 miles an hour in his Toyota Camry and rolled him up onto the hood before his body smashed into the windshield and then bounced up and over the car. As people around him fled and he heard the weak siren of the town's shitty ambulance approaching in the distance, Allan threw the car into park, popped out, and heard the body of what was Cam, Chief of Police Baumgartner, his old coach, groaning in pain. He dropped his shotgun when he was hit and seemed as if a hip, one arm, several ribs, and maybe some other bones were broken as he writhed around on the ground. Allan picked up the chief of police's shotgun as, with the hand at the end of his non-broken arm, Cam clumsily tried to take Scotty Springfield out of his holster. "This vessel is broken," the Cam thing moaned. He turned to look at Allan and smiled. "I need to end so I can," Cam started to say before Allan interrupted him. "Experience me? No, still not gonna happen, motherfucker." And Allan now slammed the butt of the shotgun right between Cam's eyes and knocked him out. He then dragged him a few feet over to the back driver's side door of his car as he heard Chloe calling out to him. "Allan, what are you doing?" After pulling and then pushing the large chief of police into his back seat, handcuffing his hands behind his back and shutting the door, Allan answered, I don't have time to explain, baby. Just know that I'm so sorry. I'll always be sorry for fucking everything up. And I'll always love you. Then, worried the time was running out, Allan jumped into the front seat and wove through the crowd of onlookers that was again growing now that the shooting had stopped. He drove as fast as he could towards the south side of town. He was no longer worried about opening the bank, of course, or being charged for Claudia's murder. He currently had one concern, and one concern only in his mind: ending all of this. About 45 minutes later, and over 30 minutes after Allan really began to worry off and on that Cam was dead instead of unconscious, when he couldn't hear him breathing for different tense stretches of time, the thing that used to be the chief of police woke. It woke long after Allan had tossed both his cell phone and Cam's out the window. He'd done that before he left town, so no one could use the GPS coordinates to figure out where the hell they'd gone. If anyone tracked them, this would all be for nothing. The Cam thing woke after Allan turned off the highway south of town onto Douglas Drive, the long and winding dirt road that led up into a bunch of BLM land, the road that ended at the Point Pleasant Reservoir. And importantly for Allan, it led to the little-known, unnamed and abandoned old logging road that then led to a plateau above the east end of the Big Deep Lake, a plateau that ended at 400-plus foot high cliffs above a seldom-used area of the remote body of water. The Cam thing moaned. I don't like this. I need to exit. I need to end this. Fuck you! Allan yelled and pounded the steering wheel with his fist. Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you! Let me loose, the Cam thing demanded. You're no longer calling the shots, asshole, Allan countered. What the hell are you? I am Cam Baumgartner. I'm chief of police. I was your coach, the Cam thing haltingly answered. The fuck you were. Tell me what you really are and I'll let you loose. Allan lied as he kept driving as fast as he thought he could handle without flying off the road. I am Cam Baumgartner. I am the chief of police. I was, the Cam thing tried to repeat. No, Allan interrupted. No, you are not Cam Baumgartner, and you weren't whoever you were before Cam, and you weren't Claudia Nelson, you piece of shit. What are you? I am Cam Baumgartner. I am... No! Allan interrupted again. Fine. Don't tell me the truth. I'm going to bury you where you will never be found, where you won't have any more vessels to jump into. What do you think of that? The Cam thing was quiet as it processed what Allan had just told it. Was he lying? Could he possibly hide it somewhere? It nervously wondered. It was so close. It just needed one more body to feed on to replicate. It had spent so much time in the cold, dead darkness of the universe. It had wondered if it would ever get to feed again, to feed, to destroy, to create, to replicate. No, you can't. You won't, the Cam thing said with a note of fear in its voice. That made Allan smile, a genuine smile for the first time since Claudia had started to stab herself. Yes, I can, he said, and I will. Whatever you are, you're done. No! 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 The Cam thing roared and struggled against his handcuffs. Allan started laughing wildly, like the crazy person he felt like he'd become. Keep struggling, dickhead! Won't make a bit of difference. What are you going to do? It's gonna be a surprise, Allan answered. You like surprises? I hope not. You're definitely not gonna like this one. Soon, ignoring the Cam thing's repetitive pleas and commands to let him loose, and continued evasiveness when it came to what it really was, Allan was turning onto that little-known, unnamed, and abandoned logging road that led to that plateau. And he was thinking about Chloe, about how he used to drive up here with her, how they'd held each other and watched the sun set across the lake, how they'd made love, how when you're 16 and in love, the world is so damn full of so many beautiful possibilities. You truly feel like you're going to live forever. You feel like somehow you might just get everything you want. You think about how the achy joints and busted backs and bad choices the generation above you loves to complain about, how that's never going to happen to you. No, you're going to figure out how to avoid all that bullshit. You're a golden god. What you would certainly never think about in those moments is how you'd be driving back to the same spot 3 decades later after completely fucking up your entire life with no way to go back and make it all okay again. Or about how this time, Instead of the love of your life, you'll have a goddamn monster in the car with you. Some kind of virus. Some kind of disease. You would have never thought you'd be coming back up here to do something truly heroic, your final act. And something, if you pull it off, you'll never get credit for. You'd never think about how the girl you still love, who now hates you, whose kids you also still love, who also now hate you, will never know that mostly you're doing this all for them. That it's their faces you'll be focused on in your final moments. It's their lives you'll still do anything to save. As a microscopic monster from a galaxy halfway across the universe slams Cam Baumgartner's vessel back and forth in the back seat, a few tears roll down Allan Fitch's cheeks. And then he smiles as he realizes he was right to come back to Dillon after all. It was his fate. Yes, he hurt Chloe, but he was also going to be able to save her now. Maybe it was his destiny to save her and to save the whole goddamn town he always wanted to leave. He laughed a bit at that. Life was truly funny. You just never know where it's going. After about 15 more minutes of driving, after nearly getting stuck in some washed-out ruts on the old, unmaintained logging road, Allan finally made it up onto the plateau. And it didn't appear, just like he'd hoped, that anyone else was around, or had been around in a long, long time. He carefully drove to near the cliff's edge before getting out of the car and walking over to look over it. It was exactly as he remembered. Straight down. He scanned the horizon, and there was no one else within sight. Early on a Friday, and in the hottest part of the summer when the fishing was the slowest, it didn't appear that anyone else was within earshot. And that was perfect. Allan now took a few deep breaths, steadied himself, and got back into his car and threw it into reverse. He backed up a good 100 yards or more, and then he turned and asked the cam thing, "How good are you at swimming?" And as the cam thing roared with fury and fear, Allan turned to face the lake and put the pedal all the way down to the floor. Roughly 10 seconds later, he'd gotten his Camry up to over 50 miles an hour before reaching the edge of the cliff, and just as he launched out into the open air and down towards the cold, deep water, his seatbelt reminder started to chime, and the last thing he did before the airbag knocked him out when he hit the water was laugh at the absurdity of it all. A few moments after impact, with the evil little passenger still trapped inside Cam's barely living body, the car started to sink. And it sank down, 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 over 150 feet before it reached the bottom. And it now appeared that maybe, just maybe, Allan's sacrifice had not been made in vain. The next day, while no one still had any idea where Allan had driven off to with the chief of police, while the sun shined on the lake, while FBI agents and the people of Dillon tried to figure out what the hell had went so horribly wrong, while Chloe spoke with an agent about the last thing Allan had said before he drove on out of town, a lone rainbow trout swimming near the east end of the Point Pleasant Reservoir felt a little pinch behind its gill, kinda like a spider bite. And that's it for this Halloween week re-release of Nightmare Fuel. Only one more re-release to go. Hope it was fun to hear this story again, or for the first time if you missed it. It was very fun in that story to set it in a place based on where I spent most of my childhood, Riggins, Idaho. A small, isolated town, such a great backdrop for terror. And as I wrote it, just made it feel so much more real to me to have spent so much time there. Today's tale was written by me, Dan Cummins, scored by Logan Keith. Thank you again to the folks at AMC's Fearfest for sponsoring these re-releases and for showcasing so many awesome classic horror movies all month long. Please go to badmagicproductions.com for all your Bad Magic needs, including show-related merch. Happy Halloween week, and stay scared.
Bad Magic Productions.